For centuries we were told a story, one of holy wars, sacred vows, and eternal enemies. The Templars and the Assassins, two forces locked in an endless struggle between light and shadow. But what if that story was never true? What if their war was only a carefully crafted illusion, designed to keep us from seeing who truly ruled from behind the veil? The truth didn't die with them. It was buried, rewritten, and disguised as faith, power, and progress. Yet fragments remain. In the symbols we still use, in the secret societies that still move unseen, and in the silence history refuses to break. If you believe some truths should never stay hidden, like, share, and subscribe to Mysteries of Earth. Because the more they try to erase, the deeper we'll dig, until every forgotten truth finally sees the light. For centuries the story was simple, almost comforting in its clarity. Two secret orders, born in the chaos of the crusades, locked in a holy war that spanned continents. On one side, the Knights Templar, Christian warriors of divine purpose, armored in white and red, sworn to protect pilgrims and defend the Holy Land. On the other, the Assassins, shadowed figures of the East, silent blades guided by the creed of freedom, striking from rooftops and mountain strongholds. That was the story we were taught to believe. But like all stories that survive too perfectly, this one was written to endure. Not because it was true, but because it served. History tells us the Templars and Assassins were enemies by faith, by ideology, by fate. Yet, beneath the symbols of cross and crescent, their origins mirror one another. Both rose from fear, from the need to survive in a world ruled by empires and faiths that demanded obedience. Both sought to preserve knowledge, order, and power in an age when truth was a dangerous possession, and both, in their own way, defied the institute, irons that created them. The Templars were never just knights. They were bankers, architects, scholars, men who turned faith into a network of influence that stretched from Jerusalem to Paris. The Assassins were never just killers. They were philosophers, guardians of forbidden texts, protectors of ideas the Church deemed heresy. To the common world, they fought from opposite sides of a sacred war. But to those who looked closer, the similarities were haunting. There are whispers in forgotten manuscripts, letters buried in monastic vaults that speak of meetings in secret chambers, Templar emissaries who vanished in Persia, assassin envoys seen in Jerusalem wearing no colors of allegiance. Their so-called war may have been a theater, a controlled dance, concealing something neither the Church nor the Caliphate could afford to expose. Because if the two orders were ever truly allied, even briefly, it meant that East and West had shared knowledge far beyond what history allows. It meant the Vatican did not command every narrative. It meant truth itself had once been free, and that freedom had to be destroyed. The chronicles that tell of their battles were written not by witnesses, but by victors. And victors have always written for survival, not for truth. The Templar archives were seized, the assassin libraries burned. Their stories rewritten, their motives simplified into good and evil. And the world accepted the legend, because it needed to. But the deeper we look, the more fragile that legend becomes. For beneath the ruins of castles in France and the silent stones of Alamut, there are markings, symbols that do not belong to one side. Intertwined crosses and blades, shared creeds inscribed in both Latin and Persian, echoes of a pact that could not exist, yet somehow once did. Perhaps the war between the Templars and the Assassins was never about land or faith or even power. Perhaps it was a performance, a grand illusion to keep the world divided, while the true war was fought over something far greater, the control of memory itself. Because in the end, the deadliest weapon in history was never the sword, it was the story. In the grand tapestry of medieval history, Few forces moved unseen, yet left marks so permanent as the Vatican. To the world, it was the center of divine authority, the heart of faith. But beneath the gold domes and whispered prayers, another institution existed, one that governed not through armies or kings, but through control of truth itself. Behind every crusade, every purge, every vanished manuscript, there was a hidden design. The Vatican was not merely guiding souls, it was shaping memory, determining what humanity would remember as sacred and what it would forget as sin. When the Knights Templar rose to prominence, their wealth and influence grew beyond the reach of monarchs. They became the first global financiers, the guardians of relics, the keepers of knowledge. Their loyalty, in theory, belonged to God. But in practice, it belonged to no one. That independence terrified the Church. The Templars' power was spiritual and worldly, a combination the Vatican could never fully control. And so began the whispers, accusations of heresy, of secret rituals, of worshipping false idols, the same strategy the Church would later use against philosophers, scientists, and mystics, all who dared to see truth outside its walls. Yet, even as the Templars faced persecution, their supposed enemies, the assassins, were being painted in equal shadow. To the Christian world, they were demons of the East. To the Muslim world, heretics. But in the shadows of both faiths, the Vatican's influence lingered. Spies, emissaries, monks who spoke Arabic fluently, they carried messages not of peace, but of control. The Church did not always need to destroy. Sometimes, it simply needed to rewrite. For centuries, the Vatican operated like a silent hand guiding the flow of time, sanctioning crusades that served not just faith, but empire. The holy wars were less about salvation and more about consolidation, bringing the wild frontiers of the world under one spiritual government. Even knowledge itself became a battlefield. Manuscripts seized from the Library of Alexandria, scrolls taken from Moorish Spain, forbidden works smuggled from Baghdad's House of Wisdom, all vanished into the Vatican archives. A vault so vast, some say it holds the very blueprint of human thought, rewritten, redacted, or erased. The deeper one digs, the clearer the pattern becomes. Those who sought universal understanding, the Templars, the assassins, the mystics of the East, were silenced, their legacies reframed as darkness. The Church needed opposition to define itself, so it created it. It sculpted enemies, manufactured heresies, and wove a war so convincing that even centuries later, we still believe it was real. And through it all, the Vatican remained untouched, silent, holy, untouchable. Its influence threaded through kings, empires, and inquisitions alike. But there were moments, faint, fleeting, when the illusion cracked. Hidden correspondences between Templar Grand Masters and papal emissaries, symbols carved beneath cathedral foundations showing both the cross and the blade. A reminder that the line between faith and control was never divine, it was deliberate. The Vatican did not simply record history, it edited it. It decided what the world should remember and who it should forget. Perhaps the greatest deception was not that the Church ruled through faith, but that it convinced the world its hand was invisible. Because in truth, it was always there, guiding the world, one erased page at a time. The night of March 18, 1314, burned brighter than most in Paris. The sky glowed with the reflection of a single fire, a pyre built not just to destroy men, but to erase a memory. At its center stood Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, bound in chains, his eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on the cathedral spires that loomed over him. The people gathered to watch a heretic die. The Church called it justice. History calls it something else. The moment silence began. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars had risen from humble protectors of pilgrims to the architects of medieval power. They had built fortresses across continents, controlled trade routes, and lent gold to kings. But their greatest sin wasn't greed. It was independence. The Templars answered to no crown, no pope, and perhaps no single faith. By the dawn of the 14th century, their influence had become intolerable. King Philip IV of France, drowning in debt to the Templar treasury, saw an opportunity to reclaim his power. But such an act could not be done in daylight. It needed a divine excuse, one only the Vatican could provide. And so, behind closed doors, a plan was crafted, an alliance between fear and faith. On Friday, October the 13th, 1307, the order was struck. In a single night, Templars across France were arrested, their wealth confiscated, their secrets taken, their voices silenced. Under torture, they confessed to crimes they never committed: heresy, idolatry, devil worship. Yet the confessions all read the same, word for word, as if written before the interrogation began. A script, not a testimony. The Pope issued decrees of excommunication. The fires were lit. But what followed those flames was more chilling than the executions themselves: the silence. No open rebellion, no revenge, no records of survivors leading uprisings. It was as if an entire order vanished in a single breath. Centuries later, historians began to notice something strange. Many of the Templars' most important relics and documents, their banking ledgers, encoded maps, letters to the East, had already been moved, weeks before their arrest. Someone knew. Someone warned them. And within that silence, another force seemed to move. The Vatican's own archives contain faint traces, papal correspondences sealed and later redacted, entire sections missing from the records of Pope Clement V, a pattern not of justice, but orchestration. The fall of the Templars was not an execution. It was a performance. A carefully arranged erasure designed to cleanse not just men, but memory. Some whispered that a secret deal had been made, that certain Templar leaders were spared in exchange for what they knew, or what they agreed to never reveal. Others believed their remaining ships sailed south, vanishing into the mists of the Mediterranean. And among those fragments of rumor lies one haunting idea: that their disappearance was not defeat, but transformation. The ashes that fell that night in Paris carried more than death. They carried knowledge, and that knowledge did not burn. Because the silence that followed the fire was not peace, it was censorship, a quiet enforced by those who feared what might rise from the smoke. The Templar's name would be buried under centuries of accusation, myth, and superstition, but every legend begins with something real. And if you listen closely to the silence that followed their fall, you might still hear it, the faint echo of men who refused to let truth die, even as the flames reached the sky. On the wind-swept cliffs of Malta, where the sea meets the sky in a cold, endless horizon, locals still whisper of a shadow that once lived among them, a silent figure who arrived without name or past. They called him Il Custode della Memoria, the keeper of memory. He came on a moonless night, aboard a small wooden vessel that carried no flags, no crew, and no cargo. Only a single chest bound in leather and a scroll wrapped tightly in linen. The fisherman who helped him ashore said he never spoke of where he came from, only that he was the last of something once vast, once holy, and now forbidden to remember. Centuries later, in the archives of the Maltese order, a faded account was discovered, written by an anonymous monk in the 15th century. The handwriting was trembling, the ink uneven, as if written in secrecy by candlelight. He bore 2 symbols upon his chest, the red cross of the Templars, and the crescent blade of the assassins. He prayed not to God, but to memory itself. It is said the man built a small stone hut on the highest hill of the island. He lived alone, except for a young orphan girl whom he raised as his daughter. Villagers often saw her carrying parchment to the sea, letting the wind scatter the ashes of what she burned. They never knew why. Years passed, and one day both the man and the child vanished. Their hut remained, empty, cold, except for one strange detail. Pinned to the wall with a rusted dagger was a piece of cloth, its fibers stained with salt and thyme. On it, written faintly in charcoal, were the words, "The two worlds were never at war, only forced to believe they had to kill each other." What the monk carried, the scroll with both the Templar cross and the assassin's crescent, may have been the final proof of a secret alliance. Some researchers believe he was what the Vatican once called a triangular liaison, one of a hand, full of envoys trained to maintain secret communication between the Church, the Templars, and the assassins. A bridge between three powers that the world thought could never coexist. When the Vatican purges began, these liaisons were erased, hunted not for betrayal, but for what they knew. And this monk, it seems, escaped with the last remnant of forbidden truth. A 17th-century Moroccan scholar later recorded a mysterious encounter. An old man came to our monastery by the sea. He wore both emblems on his chest. He asked not for shelter, nor for food. He asked that someone, some day, read what was burned. His death was never recorded, his scroll never found. Yet, from the 16th century onward, a strange dual symbol began appearing across Europe, carved into monastery walls, engraved beneath chalices, hidden within sacred manuscripts. Two emblems, the cross and the crescent, no longer opposed, but united as one. Perhaps it was a message meant not for his time, but for ours. A quiet defiance against centuries of deception. Because if the war between Templars and assassins was a lie, then history itself was built upon its ashes. And the man who carried both symbols across the sea did not seek to be remembered. He sought to ensure that truth, however faint, would never vanish completely. The keeper of memory may be gone, his name lost to the winds of Malta, but his silence was not emptiness. It was a seed, waiting for someone to listen again. And maybe, somewhere in the vaults of forgotten monasteries, his scroll still exists, waiting to be read by the one who dares to remember what the world was told to forget. In the archives of an old monastery on the island of Malta, among dust-covered relics and decaying scriptures, historians once found a thin, hand-bound booklet, unsigned, undated, and nearly illegible. The ink had faded, the parchment frayed. Yet between the lines of that forgotten record lived a story so quiet, so human, it could only have survived by accident. The tale of a monk and a child, and the final breath of a truth the world was never meant to remember. It began, as many great disappearances do, with a man escaping the noise of the world. He came to Malta by sea, carrying nothing but a linen-wrapped scroll and a chest sealed with two emblems, the red cross of the Templars and the curved crescent of the assassins. His name, if he ever had one, was erased by time. The locals called him only the hermit of the high hill. He lived in solitude, away from the villages, where the cliffs rose like the edges of the earth. But one winter, after a violent storm, fishermen found a small girl washed ashore, pale, trembling, clutching a pendant carved with strange markings. He took her in, naming her Mira, the one who remembers. To the villagers, they were ghosts in daylight, the monk and the orphan, seen only when the tide was low, collecting herbs or seawater. But what none knew was that within their small stone hut, history itself was being rewritten in secret. The man was teaching the girl to read, not from scripture, but from fragments of forbidden texts salvaged from burned libraries. He spoke to her of the two orders the world believed had perished, the Knights Templar and the Assassins. He told her they were never enemies, that their war had been crafted to blind the world. He taught her of balance, of how power survives through illusion, and how truth is never destroyed, only buried. And every night before sleep, he would unroll the ancient scroll and whisper a single vow in a language she barely understood. Let someone, someday, read what was burned. Years passed. The child grew, and with her grew the danger. The Vatican's shadow stretched long even across the Mediterranean. Rumors spread of a holy envoy searching for a heretic in Malta, a monk said to carry forbidden relics. One dawn, the villagers awoke to find the hut empty. The monk and the girl were gone. Inside, only one thing remained, a strip of cloth pinned to the wall with a rusted dagger. On it, written faintly in charcoal, "The memory is safe." What happened to them remains a mystery. Some say their small boat was seen drifting toward North Africa. Others claim the orphan carried the scroll to a desert monastery in Morocco, where it still lies hidden among ancient Sufi texts. But there is one curious clue. In the 17th century, a Persian traveler described meeting an old woman in the coastal hills of Tangier. She spoke Italian and Arabic with equal fluency, and when asked of her origins, she said only, "My father carried memory across the sea." Whether Mira was real or legend, her story haunts the margins of history, because if she truly survived, she may have been the last living link between two secret orders that the world believed had vanished. And if she carried that scroll, the one said to unite the cross and the crescent, then perhaps she also carried the last proof that their war was never real. The orphan and the scroll. A child, and a secret too heavy for her age. And perhaps through her, the final spark of forbidden truth. The memory of a world that once tried to remember itself. There are places where silence feels heavier than stone, where the air itself seems to remember what was once spoken and then erased. High on the cliffs of Malta, one such place remains, the ruins of a small stone hut, its walls half collapsed, its doorway leading to nothing but wind and sea. For centuries, no one dared to touch it. Locals called it the hermit's house. To most, it was just another relic of time's decay. But to those who listened, it whispered something far greater. When historians uncovered it in the early 1900s, they found nothing remarkable. No gold, no relics, no traces of life. Only one detail survived. On the inner wall, faint as breath, a single line written in charcoal. The two worlds were never at war. It was fragile, almost invisible beneath centuries of dust. Yet it changed everything. Because those 8 words, scrawled by a hand long turned to dust, dared to contradict the very foundation of medieval history. If true, it meant that the centuries-old rivalry between the Templars and the Assassins, two orders painted as divine opposites, had been nothing more than a lie. It meant that what the Church had called holy war was perhaps not war at all, but theatre, a performance scripted to divide belief, to control memory, to shape civilization itself. For archaeologists, it was just an inscription, but for historians who knew the legend of the monk and the orphan, it was the missing heartbeat of a story that refused to die. The charcoal matched the same rare composition found in old Maltese monasteries, a mixture of olive ash and salt. The writing style was consistent with a 14th century monastic hand, and the message itself echoed a phrase rumored to appear in a forbidden correspondence between the last Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, and an assassin envoy from Alamut. "We fight in shadows so the light may be divided." Different words, same truth. A truth that the Vatican could never allow to survive. For centuries, the Church had maintained an invisible architecture of control, not through force, but through narrative. By defining what was holy and what was heretical, it became the unseen author of history. The Templars and the Assassins were their greatest characters, each serving a role in the grand illusion. Faith versus freedom, order versus chaos, light versus shadow. But the charcoal message on that wall spoke of something else entirely. Cooperation, unity, perhaps even a secret pact. When the monk fled Malta, he took the original scroll, the one bearing both the Templar cross and the Assassin's crescent. The message he left behind was no random farewell. It was a confession, a final attempt to record what centuries of fear had tried to bury. What makes this line so haunting is not its content, but its endurance. Charcoal fades, stone crumbles, but somehow the words remained visible, as if protected by the memory of what they carried. Today, the wall still stands, though weathered beyond recognition. A faint indentation remains where the words once were, now preserved behind glass in a climate-controlled chamber. Visitors often say they feel a strange unease standing before it, not fear, but the quiet weight of realization. Because once you read those words, history itself begins to sound different. The two worlds were never at war. A message written not to the past, but to the future. A warning to all who inherit history without questioning it. Because perhaps the real war was never fought with swords or creeds. Perhaps it was fought with silence. And on that forgotten wall, silence finally spoke. History is often remembered in straight lines. Victors and vanquished, faith and heresy, truth and deceit. But the true shape of power has rarely been linear. Sometimes it was triangular. Deep within the archives of the Vatican, in a section long sealed from public record, there exists reference to a covert circle. Men trained not as warriors, but as listeners. They were called the Liaisonist Trinitas, the triangular liaison. Neither priests nor spies, they moved silently between three great forces, the Vatican, the Knights Templar, and the Order of Assassins. Their purpose was simple, yet unspeakable, to maintain communication where war forbade it. Officially, the Church had condemned the Assassins as pagans, and the Templars as corrupted by greed. Yet history reveals moments that defied that narrative, ceasefires too perfectly timed, lost couriers who somehow carried sealed papal messages into enemy territory, treaties that appeared out of nowhere. Someone had to be orchestrating the impossible. The triangular liaison was born in secrecy during the late 12th century, at the height of the crusades. A handful of linguists, scholars and monks, trained in languages of both the cross and the crescent, were selected by a shadow council under papal seal. Their mission, to deliver messages that could not be seen, to preserve alliances that could not exist. They met in hidden monasteries, often under the guise of translating texts or cataloguing relics. Each carried an identical insignia, a ring engraved with a triangle enclosing both a sword and a quill. It was said that the ring was forged from the melted hilts of a Templar blade and an assassin dagger, symbolizing their forbidden union through the Church's will. But as centuries passed, the liaison's purpose evolved. Some became double agents, believing the Vatican was not maintaining peace, but manipulation. The Church could fuel conflict when it needed war, and end it when it needed silence. The Templars and Assassins, unaware they were both being played, fought over ideologies they never truly owned. One name stands out among the liaison's hidden roster, Brother Cassian of Verona. A scholar of languages, he served as a messenger between the Grand Master of the Templars and a Persian assassin envoy. But Cassian did something no liaison was meant to do. He kept a record. In his journal, discovered centuries later within a false altar wall in Venice, Cassian wrote, "I was taught to serve silence, yet I now serve truth. The enemies they speak of are not each other, but us." That single sentence, like the charcoal message on the wall, fractured the illusion. Cassian's journal revealed encrypted transcripts of meetings that should never have existed, gatherings between Templar envoys and assassin scholars in remote monasteries where they debated philosophy, science, and the very nature of faith. The Vatican had called them heathens and zealots, but Cassian saw what they truly were. Two branches of the same tree, pruned by different hands. When the Church discovered his betrayal, Cassian vanished. Some say he was excommunicated and executed in secret. Others believe he fled to Malta, joining the same exiled monk who protected the scroll bearing both the cross and the crescent. The liaison network was quietly dissolved after his disappearance. Records were burned, names erased, their triangular insignia banned from all Vatican artifacts. Yet even today, traces remain, symbols etched in the margins of manuscripts, cryptic triangles carved into monastery walls across Europe and the Levant. And perhaps in those symbols lies the Vatican's darkest paradox, that in trying to control unity, it created division, that in orchestrating peace, it built the illusion of eternal war. For centuries, the Church's historians have written of holy battles, of crusades and martyrdom, but between the lines, there existed a quieter war. A war of messengers, secrets, and betrayal, fouteurs, but not on fields of blood, but in corridors of whispers. The triangular liaison was its heart, and Brother Cassian, its ghost. In the chronicles of war, the names that survive are those who fought, kings, knights, and zealots who believed battle was the only path to truth. But history rarely remembers those who refused to lift a sword. And yet sometimes it is their silence that outlives empires. When the Templars fell and the assassins scattered into the folds of legend, one man walked away from both banners. His name was never recorded, though the fragments that remain call him the man who refused to fight. Some said he was a monk from the Order of St. John. Others claimed he was once a Templar knight who saw too much. But what mattered was not who he was. It was what he carried. Hidden beneath his robes was a small leather scroll case, sealed in wax, marked with two symbols no one dared to place side by side, the Templar cross and the assassin's crescent. Inside, legend says, lay the last testimony of an age when enemies had once spoken as brothers, a record of a meeting that could never be acknowledged, held under the shadow of the Vatican's silent watch. He left Jerusalem as the fires of persecution burned. As his brothers were chained, and the Church's inquisitors hunted those who knew too much, he fled across the Mediterranean, avoiding ports, traveling only at night. Witnesses recall an old man arriving on the island of Malta, thin as parchment, his robes torn by salt and time. He found refuge in an abandoned chapel overlooking the sea. There, he wrote his final entry on the back of an old parchment. They wanted war to preserve faith. I wanted peace to preserve truth. He was never seen again. Some say he died quietly in that chapel. Others believe a passing fisherman helped him escape towards Sicily, and that he lived out his years hidden among scholars who still whispered of unity. But the scroll, somehow, endured. Centuries later, fragments matching its description appeared in private collections, thin strips of parchment inscribed in both Latin and Arabic, written in a hand known only from one century, the late 13th. One phrase repeated across the surviving fragments, "Where the sword divides, the word must heal." It was more than poetry. It was confession. A reminder that the true war was not between two orders, but between the human mind and its fear of truth. The monk who refused to fight understood what few dared to see. that power does not only conquer through armies, but through memory. If one could rewrite the past, redefine who was holy, who was evil, who was justified, then one could shape the future without ever lifting a blade. He carried that knowledge not as a weapon, but as a burden, because he understood that the unity between Templar and assassin was the Church's greatest threat, proof that light and shadow could coexist. When historians found the remnants of his chapel centuries later, they uncovered no body, no relics, nothing but a cracked stone floor. Yet beneath that floor lay a hollow space, carved by hand, large enough for a scroll case. It was empty. And perhaps that was the point. Because what he carried was never meant to be found, only remembered. Today, that story survives not in books, but in whispers. The tale of a man who walked away from the noise of faith and empire to preserve something greater than both. He chose exile over violence, silence over propaganda. And in doing so, he ensured that truth would outlive the war it was meant to die in. In a world obsessed with choosing sides, one man refused to fight, and in that refusal, he became eternal. Beneath the heart of the Vatican, where centuries of secrets sleep behind marble and shadow, lies a silence older than the Church itself. It is said that even the air feels different there, heavy, ancient, almost watchful. Few are permitted to walk those corridors, where light bends through narrow cracks and footsteps echo like confessions. In 1978, during a quiet renovation of the Apostolic Archives, a team of restorers stumbled upon something not listed in any catalogue, not mapped in any architectural record. Hidden behind a wall of decaying brick and forgotten manuscripts, they found a passageway descending deep into the bedrock beneath the archive vaults. The stairs spiraled downward into darkness, and at their end stood a door. It was unlike anything else in the Vatican. Forged from black iron, smooth as glass, it bore no handle, no keyhole, no visible lock. Only a faint engraving glimmered under the lantern light, a triangle enclosing two ancient symbols intertwined, the Templar cross and the assassin's crescent. The black iron door. The workers were silenced, their notes confiscated. Within days, the corridor was sealed again under papal decree, but fragments of their accounts survived, hidden in personal letters and diaries. One restorer wrote, "It was not built to keep something out. It was built to keep something in." For decades, whispers surrounded the door. Some claimed it guarded heretical writings, the lost scroll of the monk who vanished from Malta. Others said it concealed relics that challenged the very foundation of faith. But the Vatican never acknowledged its existence. Officially, no such door was ever found. Yet, researchers who've spent lifetimes studying Vatican blueprints noticed something strange. A section beneath the Apostolic Library where measurements didn't align. A gap, precisely triangular, as if an entire corridor had been erased. Could the black iron door mark the final resting place of the forbidden scroll, the document said to unite cross and crescent? Legends tell that before the fall of the Templars, a Vatican-trained liaison named Brother Cassian vanished after attempting to reveal the truth about the fabricated war. His trail ended within these very walls. Some believe the Vatican captured him, forcing him to record his confessions and seal them behind that door, a vault of silence beneath the city of God. The iron itself, according to metallurgists who studied samples from nearby gates of the same era, was of a unique alloy, mixed with trace elements not found in Italy but in the Middle East, the same materials used in the swords of the Crusades. It is as if the door itself was built from the remnants of the conflict it conceals. Inside, no one knows what remains. There are stories of faint vibrations heard by guards stationed near the restricted section, a low hum, like distant chanting, Others claim to have seen condensation forming on the walls, as if something behind that door still breathes. But perhaps what lies behind it is not a relic, not a person, but an idea too dangerous to release. Because if the scroll is truly there, if it bears the words said to be written by the monk who refused to fight, it would rewrite everything we think we know about faith, history, and the war that never was. The Vatican denies, scholars debate, and believers fear. But the door remains. No hinges, no keyhole, no explanation. Just a symbol uniting two worlds that were never meant to be enemies, preserved in iron, hidden in eternity. And maybe that is its purpose, not to be opened, but to remind us that some truths were never lost, only locked away. Deep beneath the city of God, behind the black iron door, the silence of history waits. In the winter of 1983, Vatican archivist Father Domenico Felli was assigned a simple task: to document humidity levels in the lower chambers beneath the apostolic archives. It was a quiet duty, meant for those trusted to walk among history's ghosts without asking questions. But that winter, something followed him back from the dark. Felli's journal, found years after his mysterious disappearance, contains a single entry written in trembling ink. It reads, "I heard the sound again. Not voices, not footsteps. Pages, turning. But the room was empty." For centuries, the Vatican's undercroft has been a labyrinth of sealed rooms, many older than the church itself. Some chambers were built over pagan crypts, others above forgotten Roman catacombs. But one corridor remained unmarked, the one ending at the black iron door, the same door sealed after the 1978 discovery, said to bear the united symbols of the Templar cross and Assassin's Crescent. Felli had long been fascinated by that door. He'd written to his superiors, urging permission to examine it for structural stability, claiming it resonated unnaturally when touched. His request was denied, twice, but he returned anyway. According to his journal, he descended alone on the night of December 12th. He noted the humidity level, the scent of metal and dust, and something else, a faint warmth radiating from the stone walls, though the air was freezing. When he placed his hand upon the door, he felt a vibration. Not a sound, a pulse. Then came the whisper. He described it as the soft sound of pages turning, one after another, as if someone on the other side was calmly reading. No voices, no breathing, just the rustle of parchment moving through unseen hands. He stayed only moments before fear overtook him. Yet before leaving, he wrote one final line, a line that would later vanish from the official copy of his repo. "Tad but survive in the journal recovered from his quarters. The room remembers." What did he mean? Some researchers believe that whatever lies behind that door, manuscripts, scrolls, or relics, might be preserved in such a way that air currents, temperature shifts, or natural resonance could create the illusion of movement. But others, including Vatican insiders who've since spoken under anonymity, insist the church knew exactly what was behind it. A vault containing forbidden writings by both Templar and assassin scribes, records of a pact, and of the knowledge they swore to hide. In 1984, Felli was reassigned abruptly to a remote monastery in the Alps. Within a month, he vanished on a journey to Rome. No trace of him was ever found. Only his journal remained, recovered years later by an archivist who noticed that one page, the last, was torn clean out. Those who've been allowed near the lower archive since then report that the air feels alive, as if filled with static before a storm. Some claim that the pages still whisper, especially when the Vatican bells toll at midnight. Perhaps what Father Felli heard was not merely paper, but memory, a residue of centuries past, because the scrolls hidden behind the black iron door were said to contain the correspondence between the Templars and the assassins themselves, a conversation that history was never meant to hear. And maybe, even in silence, those words still move, turning page by page, as if the room itself refuses to forget. In the Vatican's depths, the walls do not echo. They remember. And somewhere behind that door, a story long buried keeps reading itself aloud, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. There are levels of secrecy within the Vatican that most people can scarcely imagine. The world knows of secret archives and restricted manuscripts, of red seals and papal keys, but beneath those layers lies something far more impenetrable, a classification whispered only among the highest members of the Curia, a phrase never spoken outside the marble halls of the Apostolic Palace. Classificato nigram. Translated loosely, it means classified under darkness. Unlike ordinary confidential records, which protect sensitive political or theological material, classificato nigram refers to something different, something buried not to guard it, but to ensure it is never seen again. It is the Vatican's final layer of silence. The classification first appeared in internal documents in 1849, when the Papal States were under siege and the Church's archives risked exposure. But historians have long believed its origins stretch further, back to the 13th century, when Pope Gregory IX issued a decree ordering the destruction of texts unholy yet bound to the cross. According to Vatican insiders and fragments from suppressed letters, Classificato nigram was invoked only a handful of times. One such moment was after the disappearance of Father Domenico Felli, the archivist who reported hearing pages turning behind the black iron door. In early 1984, when the Vatican's internal investigators began examining Felli's notes and the sealed corridor beneath the Apostolic Archives, a single instruction arrived from the Secretariat of State. 3 words, stamped in crimson wax: Classificato nigram applied. Every record of the investigation vanished overnight. The stairway leading to the black iron door was filled with stone and plaster, its entry sealed behind a new wall. The team who had assisted Felli were quietly reassigned to distant posts, one to Argentina, another to a small parish in the Philippines. None were ever heard from again in Vatican correspondence. Why would the Church invoke its highest level of secrecy over the disappearance of one priest? The answer lies in the symbol carved upon that forbidden door, the union of the Templar cross and the assassin's crescent. To the Church, such a symbol would be heresy incarnate, proof of a unity that undermined centuries of doctrine. If evidence existed showing the Templars and the assassins once conspired, or worse, cooperated, under Vatican supervision, the very architecture of history would crack. The only surviving trace of the decree invoking Classificato nigram is a fragment of a memorandum discovered decades later in a private collection belonging to Cardinal Morsini, a known archivist and historian. The note reads, "All references to the investigation of Subterraneum 9B and FDF are henceforth sealed under nigram classification. Memory itself must obey." That phrase, "memory itself must obey," has since become a chilling motto for researchers who study the Church's buried history. For those few granted temporary access to the nigram registry, descriptions of its contents are deliberately vague, documents irrelevant, material of no theological value, subject inconclusive. But between those lines, scholars see the outline of something extraordinary, a system designed not to preserve the faith, but to manage the narrative of reality. Every major church scandal that threatened doctrine, from lost gospels to hidden correspondences, seems to trace back to the same invisible hand. Classificato nigram is not a category, it is a vault of oblivion. Today, only 3 living officials are rumored to hold its keys. Their names are never spoken, their offices are unmarked, but through them, history itself can be rewritten or erased with a signature. And so the truth about Father Felli's disappearance, the black iron door, and the sound of pages whispering in the dark, all now belong to Classificato nigram. A seal not of faith, but of fear. Because sometimes the greatest threat to belief is not doubt, it's discovery. It was never supposed to be found. Deep beneath the Vatican, beyond sealed archives and forgotten stairways, there lies a corridor. A place few even within the Church know exists. It is not listed in blueprints, nor referenced in centuries of architectural records. Yet when light once flickered upon its cold marble floor, a single inscription revealed itself, carved faintly beneath a layer of dust and time. A library for what no one is allowed to remember. Those words should not exist inside the holiest city on earth, and yet they do. The discovery was made in 1936, when a Jesuit research team stumbled upon a sealed marble door deep within the Vatican's subterranean labyrinth. It was the same black iron door marked with an unfamiliar sigil, the cross and crescent intertwined. No hinges, no handle, only silence. But when the team returned the next morning, the chamber was sealed. No explanation was given. No record of the discovery remained. For decades, whispers circulated through the corridors of the Curia. Rumors spoke of a hidden library, a place where forbidden manuscripts were locked away, not to be studied, but to be forgotten. Scholars called it Bibliotheca Obscura. Unlike the official Vatican Apostolic Library, which serves as the Church's proud repository of knowledge, this one was different. It was said to house knowledge that could not be permitted to exist, gospels that contradicted doctrine, papal correspondences that revealed too much, and relics of secret orders the Church swore it had destroyed. The few who claimed to have seen its entrance described it the same way, a corridor lined with white marble walls, perfectly smooth except for one line etched near the base, a library for what no one is allowed to remember. It was not a dedication, it was a warning. In 1972, decades after the Jesuit discovery, Father Domenico Felli's personal jour now resurfaced. Hidden among his notes was a short passage written in his final weeks at the Vatican. There are doors that lead to rooms filled not with books, but with silence. And that silence weighs more than all the words of Scripture. Modern scholars believe Felli had seen the marble inscription himself, proof that the hidden library was real. But the Vatican has never confirmed the existence of any such structure. Officially, no chamber matching its description exists beneath St. Peter's. And yet, archival anomalies tell another story. Several inventory reports between 1891 and 1924 mention a restricted chamber, classified Nigrum, with an item list redacted in full. A few of those items are still missing from all known Vatican records: Codex Malteser, Chronicles of Alamut, and De Concordia Umbrae, on the unity of shadows. Each title hints at a secret history linking the Templars, the Assassins, and the Church itself. One fragment of correspondence, preserved in the private archives of the Medici family, quotes a Vatican librarian who was later dismissed for heresy. They told us we were preserving faith, but we were preserving lies. The true library lies below, guarded by walls of fear. If the inscription truly exists, then its meaning is chilling. It implies that knowledge was not simply lost through time, it was imprisoned by design. And perhaps that is why the Vatican has always denied it. Because a library built to hide memory is not a library at all. It is a tomb, a grave for truth itself. Some say that, late at night, deep beneath the marble floors of St. Peter's, one can still hear faint echoes, like pages turning where no light reaches. Perhaps they are not echoes of books being read, but of memories that refuse to stay buried. In the winter of 1947, a storm rolled across Rome. It was the kind that silences streets. Cold, unending rain, the sound of thunder like a warning whispered to stone. Inside the Vatican's apostolic palace, a cardinal wrote a single line in his private journal. "Tonight, I met a man who did not belong to this era." His name was Samir. No record of his origin, no surname, no past. Only a ring engraved with an ancient symbol, a downward-pointing blade within a circle, the mark once worn by the assassins of Alamut. According to the journal, the man had entered the Vatican without invitation, bypassing guards, walking straight through corridors that required layers of clearance. No one saw him arrive. No one saw him leave. He appeared, as if from nowhere, in the cardinal's private study. The hour was past midnight. Rain hammered against stained glass, and yet the man's coat was dry. The cardinal, a scholar of history, and one of the few allowed access to the restricted archives, wrote that Samir spoke like a witness, not a believer, as one who had seen the centuries unfold, not read them. When asked who he was, Samir smiled. "I am a keeper of memory," he said, "and memory has been imprisoned for too long." The cardinal described his eyes as ancient but not old, eyes that carried the weight of time, eyes that seemed to look through the present into something far beyond. He claimed he had once walked through Masyaf, the mountain fortress of the original assassins, centuries ago, when its towers still stood and the Brotherhood was whole. He spoke of the Templars not as enemies, but as brothers who lost their way. "You were told we were at war," Samir said. "But the war was never between us. It was between those who feared what we knew and those who wished to remember." The cardinal, shaken but fascinated, asked what he meant. Samir leaned forward, his voice low. "Our church and my order were once one. Two paths of the same truth, divided by those who sought power over faith." He then placed a small weathered parchment on the cardinal's desk. It was written in Arabic and Latin, alternating lines, perfect symmetry. Across the top, in faded ink, the same sigil that had been found carved into the black iron door. The text was impossible to date. No official translation was ever released, but fragments preserved in the Vatican's private archives mention phrases like "the covenant of the two lights" and "the brotherhood beneath heaven." Before the guards could be summoned, the man named Samir was gone. No door had opened. No footsteps were heard. Only the faint scent of cedar and the echo of his final words remained, "Do not protect the truth. Let it protect itself." 3 days later, the cardinal was reassigned to a remote monastery. His journal was locked away, classified under Nigram, the Vatican's highest secrecy level. When his belongings were later catalogued, the parchment was missing. But one peculiar note survived, found scrawled in the journal's margin in trembling ink. "He spoke a language older than history, yet I understood every word." Decades later, declassified records mention sightings of a man named Samir across Cairo, Jerusalem, and Istanbul, each time near ancient ruins, always appearing the same, never aged. Some historians dismiss him as myth, a fabrication born of Vatican conspiracy, but others whisper that he was one of the last true keepers, a guardian of memory sent to ensure that the truth of the two worlds was never completely erased. Whoever he was, one thing remains certain. Long before our wars of belief, there were men like Samir, wanderers of time, guardians of forgotten unity, reminding us that the greatest secrets of history do not fade. They wait. In the dimly lit hospice of Santa Maria della Pietà, the smell of candle wax and rain drifted through a cracked window. The year was 1958, and Cardinal Benedetto Grimaldi, once among the Vatican's most powerful theologians, was dying in silence. He had not spoken for months. His health had faded, his faith even faster. But on the final night of his life, he broke his silence, not with prayer, but with confession. The nurse who attended him recalled that he asked for paper, ink, and a single candle. "Do not summon the priest," he said. "This is not a confession of sin. It is a confession of memory." When dawn came, the candle had melted to nothing. On the bedside table lay his final written words, a letter that would never reach Rome officially. It began with a single, haunting sentence, "Perhaps I was chosen to forget." For years, Grimaldi had served as a guardian of the Secretum Apostolicum, the Vatican's inner archive, the one few even knew existed. He had classified documents under nigram, sealed corridors beneath the Apostolic Palace, and personally oversaw the burial of records that questioned the Church's authority over truth itself. But what haunted him most was an encounter he had kept secret for over a decade, his meeting with the man known as Samir, the one who had come and vanished like a phantom of history. In his letter, Grimaldi confessed that Samir's words had never left him. The phrase, "You were chosen to forget," echoed in his mind long after that night. At first, he dismissed it as poetic, perhaps delusional. But as he aged, the Vatican's walls began to whisper. Files were disappearing. Pages were rewritten. Names were erased from official ledgers, as though time itself was being edited. He began to suspect that the institution he had devoted his life to was not preserving memory, but curating oblivion. "We call it protection of faith," he wrote. "But we are not protecting faith. We are protecting control over what humanity is allowed to remember." Among his private notes was a curious passage about a document labeled Liber Obscura, which described a pact between two forgotten orders, one bearing the cross, the other the crescent. The record of this pact had been struck from official church memory centuries earlier. When Grimaldi tried to reopen the file, he found it sealed by a decree bearing his own signature, though he swore he had never signed it. It was then he realized the truth. He had not been appointed to reveal anything. He had been chosen precisely because he would obey, seal, and forget. His final page was written with trembling hands. "Faith built on silence is no faith at all. The truth has been buried under sanctity, disguised as holiness, and guarded not by angels, but by fear." After his death, Vatican officials recovered the letter and quietly classified it under the same level of secrecy as the black iron door. The attending nurse, before being transferred, told a reporter that when she entered his room that morning, she found the candle still warm and the words "chosen to forget" faintly carved into the wooden table. Years later, a fragment of that confession leaked through underground channels, never fully authenticated, yet undeniably written in Grimaldi's hand. It ended with a line that scholars still debate. "If the truth is eternal, then so is the memory of those who buried it. I pray that one day the forgotten will remember us too." And so, the life of a man who spent decades protecting the Church's most dangerous secrets ended not in glory, but in quiet remorse. A reminder that sometimes the greatest confessions are not of sin, but of obedience. And perhaps the greatest crime of all is forgetting. It was in the spring of 1894, deep within the crumbling archives of Palermo, that a Jesuit scholar named Father Matteo Loreto discovered a scroll that should not have existed. Wrapped in goatskin and sealed with wax half melted by time, the parchment bore two distinct inscriptions, one in Latin, the other in Persian. The Latin read, "Servus Memoria," the servant of memory. The Persian followed beneath it, written in elegant Kufic script, "Kadimiyad," the same phrase in another tongue. Two languages, two civilizations, one message. Loreto at first believed it to be a simple translation, perhaps the work of missionaries who had traveled east during the Crusades. But as he carefully unfolded the brittle parchment, he realized something extraordinary. Both inscriptions were written by different hands, centuries apart. Yet the ink bore the same chemical composition. The scroll, carbon-dated later by independent scholars, seemed to exist outside of time, blending the 12th century with the 14th in a single artifact. The implication was unthinkable, that the Knights Templar and the assassins of Alamut, long thought to be sworn enemies, had shared a custodian. a servant of memory who walked between their worlds. According to Father Loretto's notes, the scroll described a pact, not of allegiance, but of preservation, a vow to safeguard a body of knowledge too dangerous to survive beneath church or caliphate alike. The two inscriptions symbolized unity in silence, the last breath of cooperation before both orders were erased by the powers that feared them. The truth, one line read, must pass unseen through the eyes of those who forget. The servant of memory was not a soldier, not a priest. He was a scribe. His role was to transcribe forbidden histories, hiding fragments within both orders, so that if one was destroyed, the other might still recall the whole. For centuries, the scroll passed unseen, moving from Jerusalem to Damascus, from a monastery in Cyprus to a vault in Venice. Each guardian added a layer of encryption, symbols and phrases meant to confuse the unworthy reader. Yet all carried the same intent, to preserve what the world had ordered to be forgotten. When Loretto presented his discovery to the Vatican, the response was immediate and absolute. Within 3 weeks, his archive in Palermo was seized under a decree marked Classificato Nigram, the same classification that silenced Father Feli decades later. The scroll vanished into the Vatican's forbidden collection, its existence officially denied. But one copy remained, a sketch that Loretto had made of the final line. It read, "Two suns may burn apart, but their light remembers the same dawn." That single sentence, in both Latin and Persian, was later found carved into a stone lintel deep beneath the fortress of Alamut, destroyed centuries earlier. Archaeologists could not explain how identical inscriptions appeared across 2 continents, or why they shared the same flaws, the same cracks in the lettering, as if carved by the same hand. Scholars who have studied the legend believe the servant of memory was more than a messenger. He was a symbol of resistance, proof that truth cannot be owned by empires or erased by theology. And perhaps, in the quiet corridors of the Vatican's lower vaults, that scroll still exists, sealed behind iron and silence, a fragile testament to the brief moment when cross and crescent dared to remember together. Because somewhere between faith and power, between conquest and silence, there stood one nameless scribe, a servant of memory, who refused to let the world forget. And it is because of him that we still remember at all. In the hush of dawn, the Sistine Chapel feels less like a monument and more like a heartbeat. The air carries centuries of incense and whispers, secrets painted into color. But among Michelangelo's divine masterpieces, one work was whispered about, not for its beauty, but for what it dared to hide. It was known in fragments, in forbidden notes passed between restorers and archivists, La Natività Segreta, the secret nativity. A painting long removed from public sight, rumored to have been hidden beneath layers of pigment, even sealed beneath a later fresco. According to a private journal found among Michelangelo's sketches, the La Natività Segreta was commissioned not for the Vatican, but against it, painted in secret during the early 1500s, when the Church's hand ruled every stroke of art and every whisper of truth. The painting, described by one witness before it disappeared, depicted the birth of Christ, but unlike any other nativity scene. Beneath the glow of a celestial dawn, the child lay not between Mary and Joseph, but between 2 guardians. One bore a cross, the mark of the Knights Templar. The other held a scroll inscribed with a crescent-shaped symbol, the emblem of the assassins. 2 ancient orders, both erased by papal decree, united at the cradle of a divine child. It was blasphemy and revelation. For in this painting, Michelangelo had done something extraordinary. He portrayed unity between faiths that the Church had spent centuries dividing. To those who saw it, the message was clear. The war between the cross and the crescent was never ordained by heaven. It was crafted by men. When rumors of the painting reached the papal court, Michelangelo was summoned. The records of that meeting have been lost, but an unsigned letter attributed to his friend Vittorio Colonna offers a chilling clue. They told him that beauty could save souls, but only if it obeyed. They told him to paint the divine, but not the truth. Within months, La Natività Segreta was removed from public display. Some claim it was overpainted with the Holy Family, others that it was sealed within a chapel wall during renovation, a fate shared by many works deemed theologically ambiguous. Yet the whispers did not die. In 1972, during an infrared scan of the Sistine Chapel's ceiling, restorers found faint outlines beneath one corner, the shape of two standing figures beside an infant, not angels, not saints, men in robes, one clutching something that resembled a blade. Further analysis was halted by Vatican officials, and the scan data classified under Classificato Nigrum, but fragments of the original sketch resurfaced years later in a private collection in Florence, a small charcoal draft showing the same composition, the cross and the scroll, balanced on either side of the child. Hidden symbolism? Perhaps. Or perhaps Michelangelo was attempting to reveal what he had quietly learned, that both the Templars and the assassins, though enemies by decree, shared a secret mission: to protect knowledge, not destroy it. Art historians who have studied the painter's letters point to a recurring phrase in his later works, il figlio della verità, the child of truth. They believe La Natività Segreta was not just a religious image, but a metaphor for the rebirth of forgotten wisdom, guarded by two worlds forced into silence. And maybe, beneath centuries of paint and power, that message still breathes, hidden under the brushstrokes of obedience, waiting for the day when truth will be allowed to be beautiful again. Because Michelangelo understood what few dared to say aloud. Even in divine art, the greatest rebellion is remembrance. In the dim light of his workshop, Michelangelo often painted alone, not surrounded by students or apprentices, but by silence. A silence that felt deliberate. Some said he feared spies. Others believed he was listening for something greater, the echo of truth speaking through pigment and shadow. But among those who studied his work closely, there's a theory whispered behind museum walls and within forgotten letters of the Vatican's private archives. Michelangelo didn't just paint for faith, he painted for secrecy. He knew things. His art was not only devotion, it was a cipher. After the creation of La Natività Segreta, the secret nativity that dared to show unity between the Templars and the assassins, Michelangelo's life changed. His letters grew colder, more cautious. The vibrant energy of the young sculptor who once defied popes and kings faded into something quieter, something watching. In his later frescoes, The Last Judgment, The Creation of Adam, the prophet Zechariah, experts began noticing something peculiar. Eyes everywhere, watching, hidden and deliberate. One pair of eyes, painted into a seemingly random cherub, stares not at the divine, but straight at the viewer. Another, tucked into the folds of fabric behind Christ's figure, seems to follow you no matter where you stand. These weren't mistakes. They were messages. Centuries later, under infrared light, restorers discovered that Michelangelo often painted over preliminary sketches, outlines that didn't match the final figures. In some cases, he moved eyes by just a fraction of an inch, enough to change where they looked, enough to change who they looked at. Some historians now believe those unblinking eyes were not symbols of heaven, but witnesses, silent guardians left to stare through time, preserving what he could not say. One Vatican report, buried under the label Classificato Nig, RAM, described a conversation between Michelangelo and Cardinal Riario, a powerful patron of the arts who also oversaw secret church investigations. In that meeting, Michelangelo allegedly said, "If truth cannot be spoken, it must be seen." That single phrase changed how his work was viewed. Every detail, from the placement of light to the angle of a gaze, became a code. The eyes, some argued, represented the Watchers, members of a hidden order sworn to safeguard forbidden knowledge. Others claimed Michelangelo himself was recruited, entrusted with fragments of a truth passed down since the days of the Crusades, a truth uniting the cross and the crescent. A 19th-century art historian, Father Aurelio Montini, found a cryptic annotation in one of Michelangelo's sketchbooks, now lost. "I have seen what they burned, but the ashes still whisper." What ashes? What had he seen that needed to be buried in symbols and stairs? Perhaps he had read something, a fragment from the Templar archive smuggled through Florence. Perhaps a scroll once sealed with two marks, one red cross, one twin-bladed crescent. If so, he knew he could never reveal it. Not to his patrons, not even to his apprentices. His only safe medium was art. And so he hid the Watchers within his work. Human eyes, divine eyes, even his own, reflected subtly in the gaze of God reaching out to Adam. A message to those who would one day notice. Michelangelo's genius wasn't only that he could carve divinity from marble or paint infinity onto ceilings, it was that he could make silence speak. He turned the walls of faith into pages of truth, the paint into prophecy, and the eyes into witnesses of a hidden pact that stretched back centuries. And if you ever stand beneath the Sistine Chapel ceiling and feel, for just a moment, as though someone unseen is watching you, perhaps it isn't your imagination. Perhaps the eyes that knew still remember. When words were censored and truth was chained to the altar of obedience, something remarkable happened. The artists began to whisper, not with their voices, but with color, stone, and form. History often remembers art as beauty, but for those who lived under the weight of dogma, it was rebellion. A rebellion painted quietly into the corners of cathedrals, carved beneath the folds of marble robes, and woven into tapestries that only the wise could read. When the Vatican tightened its grip on knowledge, declaring what could and could not be remembered, artists found themselves at a crossroads, obey or remember, and many chose remembrance. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the great age of art coincided with an invisible war, not fought with swords, but with symbols. As the Templars vanished into ash and the assassins into legend, their memory survived through brush and chisel. Leonardo da Vinci painted the Last Supper, but look closer. 12 disciples form a triangle, their hands pointing toward an empty space where a chalice should be. Some saw it as an accident. Others saw it as code, the missing grail, the silence of those erased. Botticelli, once accused of heresy, painted the mystical nativity, angels and mortals embracing under a golden dome, with inscriptions hinting at a world reborn from those who remember. Even the placement of his figures seemed to echo an ancient balance, light and shadow, faith and doubt, cross and crescent. Art had become something more than devotion. It was a vault of forbidden history. Across Europe and the Middle East, scattered in frescoes, manuscripts and mosaics, fragments of the same idea appeared. Two symbols intertwined, sometimes a cross woven into a crescent, sometimes a dagger hidden beneath a halo. Few noticed, but those who did saw the pattern. A silent network of memory, bound not by letters or orders, but by art itself. Painters, sculptors, architects, they became the new keepers of the truth once held by the Templars and the assassins. Each brushstroke was a confession disguised as beauty. Each statue, a record of what could no longer be spoken aloud. And behind them, unseen but ever present, stood the church. Not blind, but watchful. They knew. They always knew. Records from the 16th century mention papal inspectors who visited artists' workshops to review for theological accuracy. Many of those visits ended with sudden disappearances, burned sketches, sealed studios. Yet somehow, the forbidden images always survived, hidden in chapel corners, private altarpieces, or the back pages of illuminated manuscripts, because memory, once born, refuses to die. There's an ancient phrase attributed to a Florentine painter named Tommaso de Vieri, who was rumored to have connections with a secret brotherhood of scholars. When ink was forbidden, we painted. When paint was forbidden, we carved. When stone was forbidden, we sang. Every generation found its own way to preserve the truth, even if it had to hide it beneath layers of beauty. By the dawn of the Renaissance, art had quietly become humanity's greatest weapon of memory. It was how the silenced spoke, how the erased endured, how the forbidden survived. And perhaps that's why so many masterpieces from that era still seem to look back at us, because within them, the forgotten voices of the past still live, still remembering, still resisting. They remind us of one thing. You can destroy an order, burn a library, or silence a name, but you cannot silence the memory that has learned to paint itself into eternity. In 1978, deep within the archives of the Vatican Library, a Belgian historian named Dr. Ilias Mertens uncovered something that was never meant to be seen again. A document sealed with 3 insignias, a cross, a crescent, and the papal keys of Rome. He called it the Pactum Obscurum, the Hidden Pact. According to his private notes, it was signed in 1099, the same year Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders. The signatures belonged to representatives of 3 powers once thought irreconcilable: the Knights Templar, the Assassins, and Pope Urban II himself. For centuries, history painted these orders as mortal enemies, holy warriors and heretics locked in endless war. But Merton's discovery suggested something far more complex. Beneath the surface of blood and faith, there had been an understanding, a shared fear that the truth they protected could not survive the chaos of men. And then, as quickly as he appeared, Dr. Elias Mertens was gone. He vanished on the night of June the 14th, 1978, leaving behind an empty apartment in Rome, an unfinished lecture manuscript, and a burned envelope addressed to the University of Louvain. The local police called it a disappearance. His colleagues called it a warning. But what did he truly find? According to a surviving photocopy found years later in a private collection, the Hidden Pact outlined a chilling alliance. In the aftermath of the First Crusade, as both sides buried their dead, envoys of the Templars and the Assassins met under the approval of Urban II. Their goal? To preserve knowledge, mathematical, astronomical, and spiritual, that could not fall into the hands of zealots or kings. This was not a peace treaty. It was an agreement to hide truth. They created secret repositories, archives buried beneath monasteries, mosques, and libraries, where forbidden manuscripts and ancient instruments would be safeguarded. The Pact Deck. Lard that wisdom, once found, must be hidden until the world learns mercy. It was signed with 3 symbols: the cross, the blade, and the seal of the fisherman. When Mertens tried to publish his findings, he was denied by every academic press he approached. Vatican officials dismissed the claim as an imaginative fabrication. But colleagues noticed he had grown paranoid in his final weeks, seeing strangers outside his window, receiving unmarked letters, and speaking of doors that must never be opened again. The day before he disappeared, Mertens gave a final lecture at Sapienza University, One student remembered his closing words: "Truth is not lost. It is simply buried beneath the ruins of its protectors." Within hours his apartment was sealed, his notes confiscated, and his name quietly erased from institutional records. But fragments remained. A microfilm copy of a Latin parchment, a Persian translation hidden in a private library in Cairo, and whispers among researchers who claimed to have corresponded with him, letters signed not with his name, but with a phrase in Latin: Servus Memoriae, servant of memory. Who was he serving, and what truth did he die protecting? To this day, no one has found the original document Mertens described. Some believe it still lies somewhere in the Vatican's secretum, filed under restricted archives. Others think it was destroyed, along with the man who dared to read it. But one thing remains certain. The signature of that hidden pact connects threads of history once thought separate: the Templars, the Assassins, and the Church itself. Three powers united, not by faith, but by fear. The fear of what would happen if humanity ever remembered what they chose to forget. And perhaps that is why Dr. Elias Mertens had to vanish. Because some truths, even now, are too dangerous to survive the light. In 1993, a fragment of parchment surfaced in a private collection in Geneva, yellowed, brittle, and marked with faint Arabic and Latin notations. To the untrained eye, it looked like a trade map of the Levant, but to those who could read its language of geometry and secrecy, it told a different story, one that history had carefully erased. It depicted a road, not a merchant's trail, nor a pilgrim's path, but a hidden artery of faith and silence, stretching from the port city of Acre on the Mediterranean coast to the mountain fortress of Alamut, deep within Persia's rugged peaks. For centuries, Acre was the last Crusader stronghold, the place where East and West collided in blood, faith, and gold. Alamut, on the other hand, was the legendary stronghold of the Assassins, a citadel of knowledge, mathematics, and mystery, carved into the clouds of northern Persia. No historian had ever imagined that these two worlds could be physically connected. Yet the map, drawn in overlapping symbols of cross and crescent, suggested otherwise. It bore a name whispered in both tongues: Via Sancta Occulta, the hidden holy road. According to the marginal notes, the route had been established in the 12th century under a covert alliance between select members of the Templar order and emissaries of the Assassins of Alamut. Its purpose was not trade, conquest, or conversion, but communication. Hidden monasteries, caravanserais, and way stations lined the path, each marked by a distinct emblem, a serpent coiled around a chalice. These stations were said to house couriers, scholars, and scribes who carried messages too dangerous to be entrusted to kings or caliphs. Some carried manuscripts, others relics, and some only silence. The journey between Acre and Alamut could take months, winding through deserts, mountain passes, and forgotten oases, but each stop was a sanctuary of Und, a standing, where monks in white robes broke bread with scholars in red cloaks, where languages blended and secrets passed not through ink, but through memory. And yet, the road's greatest secret wasn't its existence. It was its disappearance. When the Mongols destroyed Alamut in 1256, chronicles recorded the fortress reduced to ash. But a Persian chronicler named Nasir al-Quzairi wrote something different. The library burned, but not its road. For what was hidden in stone shall walk the earth as men. Was he referring to the couriers, the living vessels of knowledge who carried what could not be written? Or was it a clue that the road still existed beneath the earth, encoded in tunnels and catacombs stretching from Jerusalem's foundations to the highlands of Iran? Modern satellite scans of the Levantine deserts have revealed a curious alignment, a faint pattern of underground corridors, now filled with sand, connecting old Crusader fortresses and forgotten shrines. Each one lies precisely along the path described in the Via Sancta Occulta, and at the end of that line, the ruins of Alamut itself. When explorers visited the site in the early 2000s, they uncovered a narrow passage beneath the fortress, sealed with carved Latin script that read, "Non est bellum inter mundos." There is no war between worlds. The same words later found in the Vatican's hidden walls. Was this the final proof that the Templars and assassins were never true enemies, but collaborators in a quiet, sacred mission to preserve knowledge through darkness? Perhaps the Holy Road was never meant to be walked by armies, but by memory itself, carrying wisdom from the shores of Acre to the heights of Alamut, from west to east, from faith to faith. Today, archaeologists call it a myth. Historians call it coincidence. But somewhere beneath the earth, between the ruins of stone and silence, lies the trace of a forgotten road that once connected not just two cities, but two souls of civilization. The hidden Holy Road, a path that reminds us that even in the darkest ages, there were those who dared to build bridges instead of walls. In 1889, amid the sun-bleached ruins of Alexandria's old harbour, a British archaeologist named Henry Caldwell stumbled upon something that didn't belong to any known dynasty, inscription, or empire. It wasn't carved into stone, nor written with care. It was painted, hastily, as though time itself was chasing the artist. On a crumbling section of seawall, half submerged beneath layers of coral and salt, there were two figures, or rather two hands. One extended from the left, wrapped in a sleeve of white linen, a mark of Western monastic dress. The other emerged from the right, robed in deep red, a style known from Persian manuscripts. Between them, a single scroll, suspended in mid-air. And beneath the image, written in fading Greek, "Those who once spoke now sleep beneath the waves." At first, Caldwell dismissed it as a piece of anonymous portside graffiti, perhaps a sailor's idle hand. But when he compared its iconography to known medieval symbols, a troubling pattern began to emerge. The gesture, the scroll, the cross-hatched crescent behind it, all mirrored the markings found in Templar ruins in Cyprus and assassin fortresses in northern Persia. It was as though two worlds, divided by centuries and continents, had left their last signature on a wall that now looked out to a drowned past. Alexandria, the city of knowledge, where the world's greatest library once stood. A place where memory and fire met for the last time. And yet, what if this graffiti was not a random mark, but a message, left by those who once guarded truth through silence and shadow? Caldwell's notes described the wall's unusual depth. Behind the outer plaster lay layers of paint, each older than the next, as if generations had preserved or replicated the same image, unwilling to let it fade. Beneath the final surface, under candlelight and dust, his team found more words in Latin. Servit, memoria, servants of memory. That phrase had appeared before, in the archives of the Vatican, in reference to an order that supposedly never existed. An order said to protect the unity once shared by the Templars and assassins, long before the Church rewrote their history. The graffiti in Alexandria may have been their last marker, a quiet acknowledgement that those who had carried forbidden truth were gone. Those who once spoke now sleep beneath the waves. But what waves? Some believe it refers to the earthquake of 365 CE, which submerged parts of ancient Alexandria beneath the Mediterranean. Others suggest a later event, perhaps a coded reference to those who were drowned in secrecy, erased not by water, but by the flood of propaganda. In 1953, divers exploring the submerged ruins near the Palace of Cleopatra discovered a slab of marble bearing a nearly identical image. Two hands exchanging a scroll, etched rather than painted. Its placement matched Caldwell's original wall, as though the message had been repeated again and again, across centuries, across mediums, across rising tides. One diver reported seeing something strange under the silt, faint grooves forming an emblem, a cross interlocked with a crescent. The artifact was quietly removed, transported to a private collection, and never seen again. Caldwell's notes, too, disappeared from the British archives during World War II. Only fragments remain. His sketches of the two hands, the scroll, and the haunting words beneath. Today, the site lies under the sea, unreachable, undisturbed. But when sunlight pierces the shallow Mediterranean waters, it is said that the wall still shimmers faintly, as though the paint itself remembers. Some claim it is mere coincidence. Others whisper that it marks the final resting place of the servants of memory, those who carried the secret unity between two worlds until time itself swallowed their traces. Perhaps the waves did not bury them. Perhaps they preserved them, as the sea often does with what the earth seeks to forget. Beneath Alexandria's waters, truth still sleeps, waiting for someone to listen to what the stones have always known. There are places in the world where memory does not die. It simply waits. Not in books, not in monuments, but in the strange, unbroken rhythm of rediscovery. Historians call it coincidence. Others something closer to sentience, the idea that archives themselves remember, that knowledge once erased finds a way to be written again. It begins, as it often does, with loss. Across the centuries, history has burned more pages than it has ever kept. From the Library of Alexandria to the secret collections of the Vatican, fire and silence have been humanity's favorite tools of control. What could not be understood was destroyed. What could not be destroyed was hidden. But every few generations, someone, a monk, a scholar, a wanderer with no name, stumbles upon what should no longer exist. And each time, the story returns. In 1624, a scribe in Florence copied a strange Latin passage found inside the spine of an old Bible. The words read, "Those who guard truth do not vanish. They change form." 2 centuries later, an identical phrase surfaced in an Arabic manuscript purchased in Cairo. Neither author knew the other, nor could they have, yet the handwriting was the same. Coincidence, or memory rewriting itself through time? This is what modern researchers call the paradox of the recurring record. Moments when documents thought destroyed are found again, not as copies, but as re-expressions, resurfacing in unexpected languages and places. And nowhere does this phenomenon appear more vividly than in the study of the Templar and Assassin archives, 2 traditions long said to have been wiped from history. When the Vatican declared Classificato Nigram centuries ago, the highest level of archival erasure, every trace of the supposed unity pact between the orders was meant to disappear. Yet fragments kept reappearing. Letters, sketches, marginal notes in unrelated books, all pointing to a buried truth, that the war between them had never been real. As though the archives themselves refused to forget. In the 1970s, researchers cataloguing damaged manuscripts in the monastery of Mar Saba near Jerusalem discovered a series of faint imprints beneath the ink of unrelated texts. Using ultraviolet light, they revealed what appeared to be overwritten lines, a ghost text written centuries earlier. The translation read, "The ink fades, but the will of memory does not." It was signed with a symbol, a cross interlocked with a crescent. No record of such a text exists anywhere in official history. No name, no reference, no catalogue number. And yet, there it was, written again by no visible hand. Some believe these are accidents of preservation, random coincidences caused by parchment reuse. But others whisper that the scribes of the past knew what they were doing, that they wrote beneath the surface of other words, trusting that someday someone would look deep enough to find them again. Because perhaps memory is not something we keep, perhaps it keeps us. Across every empire that tried to control it, from Rome to the Church, from inquisitors to scholars, the story of forbidden truth returns like a heartbeat in the soil. And today, when we scan these ancient pages with machines that can read what no human eye could, we find echoes, invisible sentences, repeated across continents and centuries, all carrying the same message. I was not meant to survive, and yet I remember. Maybe the archives never died. Maybe they simply learned how to hide. Because what we call history might just be memory, waiting to remember itself again. History teaches us that the Templars were burned, the assassins were erased, and their ashes scattered to the wind. But ashes have a strange habit. They do not vanish. They settle quietly in the corners of time. And one day they take shape again. The end of the medieval orders did not mark their destruction. It marked their transformation. From their ruins rose new names, new symbols, new faces hidden behind the same eternal purpose, to protect knowledge from those who would misuse it, and to guard power from those unworthy to wield it. It began in the 17th century, in the candle-lit halls of Europe. Men of science, philosophy, and quiet rebellion began meeting in secret, not for worship, but for memory. They called themselves Freemasons. Their rituals echoed Templar initiation rites, the oaths of silence, the geometry of their symbols, the reverence for Solomon's temple. Their compass and square were not inventions of builders, but of preservers. Within their architecture lay the remnants of something much older, a code of conduct passed down through invisible hands. Some believe they inherited it directly from the Templars who escaped persecution in 1307, sailing from La Rochelle with cargoes that were never found. Others whispered that the Freemasons were the Templars reborn, cloaked in modern reason. And yet, another current flowed in the shadows: the Illuminati. Founded in Bavaria in 1776, the Order of Adam Weishaupt sought to unite rational thought with ancient wisdom, challenging both monarchy and church. To most historians, they were merely a political movement, but buried in their earliest manifestos are references to the forgotten covenant of East and West, a phrase that mirrors the lost alliance between the Templars and assassins. It was as if these new societies were not new at all, merely new faces wearing ancient masks. By the 19th century, and the same fire had crossed the Atlantic. In the secret chambers of American universities, young men gathered to discuss influence, secrecy, and destiny. They called themselves Skull and Bones, a name evoking both mortality and resurrection. Their insignia, two crossed bones beneath a skull, mirrored the oldest known Templar tomb carvings found in the ruins of Cyprus. Coincidence? Or continuity? Documents unearthed in the early 20th century revealed that members of these societies shared a common fascination, not just with wealth or politics, but with memory. The preservation of knowledge outside the reach of public history, the same mission the old orders once carried in silence. Freemasonry built temples in the open, but buried meaning beneath stone. The Illuminati sought enlightenment, but wrapped it in rebellion. Skull and Bones pursued power, but spoke in riddles about the unseen architects. And through it all, one theme remained: the guardianship of forgotten truth. Perhaps the destruction of the Templars and assassins was never an ending, but a pruning, a way for their roots to spread unseen, deeper into the soil of civilization. When Napoleon uncovered Templar ruins in the Holy Land, he reportedly said, "They were not destroyed. They became us." Modern secret orders may not wield swords or daggers, but their symbols still whisper of unity between cross and crescent, of a time when knowledge, not creed, was sacred. The old names were burned, the banners buried, the fortresses turned to dust. But in private chambers and coded letters, the flame was passed on. Today, that flame flickers in the logos of banks, in the architecture of cathedrals, in the silent gestures of power that cross oceans and centuries. The shadow orders were never reborn. They were never gone. They simply learned the oldest secret of all. To survive, one must become invisible. Power never truly disappears. It only changes its face. What once wore armor and carried the cross now wears suits and carries contracts. What once swore oaths beneath candlelight now hides behind boardroom doors. The alliance that began between blade and faith has survived every empire, every war, every supposed revolution. It walks among us still, unseen, unnamed, yet unmistakably there. From the fall of the Templars to the ashes of the Crusades, the hands that guided kingdoms simply adapted. They no longer ruled from thrones or pulpits, but through influence, through knowledge, through finance, through the slow turning of invisible gears that shape the world we call modern. The Freemasons, Illuminati, and Skull and Bones were not accidents of secrecy. They were continuations, new masks for an old covenant. A covenant between two ancient orders that once balanced faith and knowledge, east and west, shadow and light. By the 18th century, those same ideals had taken root within Europe's most powerful families, the Medici, the Rothschilds, the Habsburgs, each tied, directly or quietly, to the remnants of the old Templar banking network. What began as Crusader treasure vaults evolved into the backbone of global finance. The symbols etched in medieval stone now glimmered on coins, seals, and company crests. Meanwhile, in the East, the legacy of the assassins took a different form. Whispered traditions of unseen diplomacy, coded brotherhoods, and silent watchers who manipulated events through subtle influence rather than open warfare. Their methods survived not in blood, but in the art of persuasion, infiltration, and unseen control. As the world industrialized, these two strands, one of money, one of manipulation, began to intertwine again. The Vatican, still guarding its own archives and secrets, served as a quiet observer. Officially, the Church stood apart for us. On such orders, yet documents declassified in the mid-20th century reveal secret audiences between high-ranking clergy and members of certain benevolent societies. The meetings were never recorded, but their effects can be traced in the synchronized rise of corporate empires and global institutions that answered to no crown. Even wars became tools of their making. The crusades of the past transformed into economic crusades, technological crusades, and ideological ones. The battlefield was no longer the desert sands of Jerusalem, but the invisible realms of information and finance. Today, their presence is disguised as coincidence, symbols hidden in architecture, in currency, in the logos of corporations that shape our daily lives. The all-seeing eye, the twin pillars, the sacred geometry that once guided Templar cathedrals now shape the world's capitals. And while we scroll through screens and follow headlines, their network continues its quiet orchestration, the same silent pact that began nearly 1,000 years ago. In the ruins of Malta, beneath the old monasteries of Portugal, and in the forgotten vaults under the Vatican, fragments of their correspondence still exist, sealed letters bearing both the cross and the crescent. And though most historians dismiss them as clever forgeries, one thing remains true. Every great empire that has risen since the 14th century has mirrored the structure of these lost orders: centralized power, secret councils, unseen initiations. Perhaps the real war never ended. It simply evolved into a different kind of battlefield, one fought not with swords, but with silence. Because those who once commanded crusades now command nations. Those who once protected pilgrims now protect secrets. And those who once swore to unite faith and knowledge still move unseen, their hands guiding the levers of the modern world. The faces have changed, the names are new, but the symbols remain. And if you follow them closely enough, through marble, metal, and money, they all lead back to the same origin: the cross, the crescent, and the covenant that refused to die. What if everything we know about history was written to keep us from knowing the truth? For centuries the story was simple: knights and killers, faith and heresy, crusaders and assassins locked in eternal war, a tale of light versus darkness. But what if both sides fought for the same truth? What if the war itself was never theirs, but ours, scripted by the hands of those who feared what humanity might one day remember? When the Templars vanished into the smoke of persecution and the assassins faded into legend, a strange silence settled over the world. History moved on, but the truth did not. It was buried, rewritten, sanctified, and then sold to generations as gospel. The victors, as always, became the authors. And what they feared most was not an enemy, but an awakening. Hidden deep within Vatican vaults and Eastern archives, fragments of old texts whisper a different story: that the Knights Templar and the Hashashin once shared a secret alliance, that beneath the mask of holy war they exchanged knowledge, guarded relics, and protected something far more dangerous than gold: an ancient truth about the origins of civilization itself. But as that knowledge began to spread, as it threatened to unite science and faith, reason and spirit, the powers that ruled the world acted. The Church called it heresy, the kings called it treason, and in one coordinated strike, both orders were erased from history, their libraries burned, their languages forbidden, their symbols turned into warnings. Yet, as every historian knows, when something is buried so carefully, it's not meant to be forgotten. It's meant to be hidden. The greatest cover-up in history was not the destruction of knowledge, but its substitution. The manuscripts that survived, the chronicles, the approved histories, were rewritten to turn allies into enemies and truth-seekers into villains. The Templars became greedy zealots, the assassins became bloodthirsty fanatics, and the real secret, that they once worked together to preserve forbidden wisdom, vanished from public record. What was that wisdom? Ancient maps of pre-flood civilizations, lost technologies buried beneath temples long before the First Crusade, mathematical systems found in both Islamic architecture and Gothic cathedrals, knowledge that could have unified East and West, revealing that humanity's origins were shared, not divided. To those in power, that unity was the ultimate threat. Because a united humanity needs no ruler, no savior, no fear. So history was rewritten, wars were sanctified, books were banned, and the narrative was controlled, not just by monarchs and popes, but by the secret councils that rose from their ashes. The same councils that still whisper behind closed doors today. Every generation that followed inherited not the truth, but the version of truth we were meant to believe. Our education, our religions, even our sciences, each carrying the fingerprints of the same architects who built this illusion centuries ago. But cracks are beginning to show. In the digital age, fragments of forbidden manuscripts, uncovered ruins, and hidden correspondences are being revealed faster than they can be silenced. And what they reveal is chillingly simple. The war between Templars and assassins never ended, because it never began. It was invented to divide us, to control what we seek, and to keep the true story of human civilization buried beneath layers of myth and manipulation. The question now is not whether the truth exists, but whether we're ready to face it. Because once you begin to see beyond the script of history, you can never unsee the hands that wrote it. The Templars, the assassins, they were never enemies. They were guardians, and what they guarded was us. History is not just what was written, it's what was allowed to survive. The rest was silenced, sealed behind iron doors, painted over, or buried beneath centuries of obedience. The story of the Templars and the assassins was never about good versus evil. It was about control, of truth, of memory, of the human spirit itself. Yet every erased line, every forbidden scroll, whispers the same message. The truth cannot be killed. It waits, in art, in ruins, in the minds of those who still question. If this journey made you think, like, share, and subscribe to Mysteries of Earth, because together we awaken what history tried to bury. The past is speaking, softly, urgently, through the cracks of time. All we must do is listen,